people are scared. It's a time of big change.
Do we need workforce housing for migrant labor?
I'm convinced there's still going to be housing demand, but how that looks is in a real state of flux. How can we do better? Living in the Yakima Valley, saw the poor housing conditions that a lot of people have to live in. It's just a fundamental building block for life. Many rural communities have very limited housing stock, and it's often poor quality. People who live there often more health problems. We have an opportunity to do something about that.
It's a domino effect of that fear.
It's important for those of us who believe in and are dedicated to this work to speak up about it. This can make a difference.
I'm going to start this off with just a really solid good morning. Good morning, Marty.
Good morning, Roger. Great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be with you as well. You had suggested that you're calling in from Yakima, the city of up in the Northwest. I've heard that referred to often as the Palm Springs of the Northwest, with plenty of sun. And right back at you, Marty. I'm calling in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. We have our sun here as well. What we don't have is your water. So really envious of water and the fact that we're going to be talking about agriculture and housing and where those meet. I have some limited familiarity with Yakima and a little bit in the Northwest. Have you ever been down here in the Southwest at all?
I have. I've gotten to spend some time in New Mexico. One of my sisters lived, in fact, outside of Albuquerque for a few years, and also got to visit as part of my member. I'm a board member with Rural Community Assistance Corporation, RCAC, and we've visited New Mexico a few times during my board tenure.
Yeah, RCAC has a really solid name and reputation all across Indian country. So happy to hear that you're associated with that great group, and really happy to hear you've been here in New Mexico.
Yeah,
So, Marty, if you don't mind, who is Marty Miller?
yeah. Well, I grew up in Washington State, and have lived here for many, many years. And I'm the executive director of a nonprofit. It's called the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing. It sounds kind of governmental, but we actually are a 501c3 with a board of directors that are volunteers. And we're based in Yakima, as you noted, Roger, and we work throughout Washington State in rural communities. And as an organization, we focus on creating affordable housing in rural communities. That could be housing for seniors or workforce housing or housing for people who are struggling with homelessness, a whole wide variety.
It seems like that's just incredibly important work and even more critical today than it was yesterday. This whole issue of homelessness, it doesn't take you very far. You can go far and wide and you'll see homelessness just about in every, major city and even in some rural cities
Yeah.
nowadays. And so really commend you on that work. Before we jump in, though, to that amazing and professional work you do, what got you here in terms of like your life's mission, your life's path, your migration story, so how did you get started?
Yeah, that's a great question too, Roger. I grew up. My parents had an apple orchard, and I grew up helping, doing the thinning and the pruning and harvesting, and got to see a lot of the hard work that went into it, and the migrant farm workers who were a necessity to try to, help get products to market, and not only migrant farm workers, but the local community too, who are just a critical piece of that economic puzzle and part of our community. And and I also saw living in the Yakima Valley, saw the poor housing conditions that a lot of people have to live in.
Hmm.
And from an early age, my family, we talked and tried to act on how can we do better as a community? And so as I became an adult, I started studying things like economic development and with a focus on rural areas. And that over the course of time led me to affordable housing as one of the ways that we can make inroads to hopefully give people an opportunity for a healthier, more stable life with quality housing. Um, and that I believe, that it's an important resource that everyone should have access to. It's just a fundamental building block for life that I think we as a nation should be able to deliver.
Hmm. So you said you studied economics. Well, where'd you go to school at?
As an undergraduate, I went to Whitworth University in Spokane and then worked for a couple of years in a variety of areas. And then I ended up getting a master's degree from Eastern University, which is in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And that was in economic development.
You know, when I looked at your bio, I had Eastern University. I figured that was in Ellensburg, Washington. Is
Yeah.
is that Eastern there in Ellensburg?
Actually, that's you're thinking of Central Washington
Yeah, Central.
University.
Sorry. Yep. That's the
Yeah,
one.
and there is a Eastern Washington University, which is over in Cheney, right next to Spokane,
Okay.
and yeah, so and that's a common, when I talk about Eastern University, a lot of people think about the school in Cheney, but I wound up on the East Coast and with because they had this economic development program that I was very interested in, and this was the early 90s, and it was a unique program at the time. It wasn't offered in a lot of places.
You know, Marty, when I think about your story as you're presenting it in terms of your life path, when you think about agriculture, growing up in an orchard family, a farming family, and then you think about the impression of those that needed to be better housed. I understand those two motivations. How does economic development fit into that? Because there's agriculture and then there's housing, and I think most people don't, at least for myself anyway, don't think about economic development as a central theme around agriculture or housing. Can you tell me how does that fit in terms of your life's mission and making you decide to choose economic development as opposed to agriculture, or choose the development as opposed to like building and like some of the trades?
Yeah, yeah. Um, toward as I was becoming an adult, and my parents were continuing the farming operation. Uh, Unfortunately, that it became a struggle to keep that afloat. It was, ag in our area was consolidating and growing, into much larger operations. We were a small outfit, and the short story is we're not able to sustain it. And so, my folks got out of that business, and and I didn't see a future for myself in, trying to get in kind of the more corporate farming type of a world, which seemed like where things were headed. Um, and so the economic development element, that was it was a lot about job creation
Hmm.
as I got more into it, and it was also about access to capital, especially for communities that have traditionally been kind of shut out of that access to capital.
Hmm.
And so that really helped lead to affordable housing in rural communities because the through creating housing, it is a job creator, both for construction and the trades associated with building. But then you often have, the people who are operating it, doing the maintenance work, doing property management, all that sort of stuff. And then there still is a big ag presence, as I know you're well aware, Roger, in your communities that you serve too.
Hmm.
That's an important um, um, it's an important the word's escaping me right now, but not job, but vocation.
Hmm.
That was the word. Where it's not only a way to generate some income, but it's part of people's identity, that this is an important value and important lifestyle, in addition to creating income for daily living.
Marty, we recognize you as a kind of a leader in housing development. I would even use word expert. Given your background of agriculture, given your background of economic development, and then kind of landing in this, title that I would kind of give to you in terms of like a housing development expert. Was there like one moment where there was like a pivotal, defining moment where you said, I'm really going to not pursue agriculture. I'm not going to pursue economic development as a standard, like an economist or somebody like a developer, but really more focused in on just this housing piece. Was there one story, one event, one point that brought you to focus in on housing to lead you to who you are today, which is a housing development expert?
There was a time, Roger, that what it was not so much related to economic development, but it was related to recognizing that there was a nonprofit sector out there that I wasn't familiar with,
Hmm.
that was dedicated to trying to improve conditions for people. And a friend and colleague and mentor of mine, uh, his name was Michael, years ago, as we were talking about what to do with our lives, and what kind of lives we wanted to lead and what kind of impact we wanted to try to make on our communities and our world, hopefully, to try to move things in a positive direction. Um, I was introduced to this nonprofit sector that, frankly, I was previously not aware of, and so the group that I most immediately was introduced to was Habitat for Humanity, where they have a number of groups that are working on housing in many communities and providing home ownership opportunities. And that was a real eye opener for me and a very positive experience where I got to participate with some of the construction projects and do an outreach to communities to try to provide a housing opportunity for people. And so I found that I enjoyed and found a lot of fulfillment in working in communities directly with people rather than, for example, being working on policy stuff or kind of working in more of a setting where you're not as directly involved with community members and the people that you're trying to serve and help with opportunities.
Marty, did you just say joy, fulfillment, and policy stuff all in the same, all in the same sentence?
Yeah, right. It was a pretty long sentence, wasn't it?
Well, I think most people don't think about
Yeah.
joy and
So
fulfillment when you think about policy,
we
but
are,
yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
so I guess one of the other pieces of the puzzle, Roger, was that my undergraduate degree was in political science.
Ah, there we go. There's the
And
missing piece of the puzzle.
so, yeah, right. So one of my experiences, and this is part of how I wound up on the East Coast, is I moved to Washington, D.C. for a few years, and I was fortunate to get a job on Capitol Hill. I worked for a subcommittee in the Senate, and it was quite a education. And I really learned a lot. I enjoyed the experience, but I also learned that this is not what I want to do for my whole life.
Hmm.
It felt too disconnected to, what's really happening in many communities. And so that was also a formative experience, like you were asking about before, but it was, I saw some of the resources that could be created, but I also felt, to be honest, kind of disconnected to how those efforts really hit the ground, and either worked or didn't work in the communities that they were supposed to serve. So that led me to um, pursue a different path, which was more the economic development element that we spoke about earlier, and working and getting involved in communities, hands-on, uh, shoulder to shoulder, and I've really found that I've really enjoyed that work.
Marty, when you were in D.C., did you work for a member of Congress? Did you work for a committee or both?
I worked for a committee. It was within the Labor and Human Services Committee,
Okay.
and it was because there was as a Washington State senator at the time. His name was Brock Adams, and he was a member of the committee. And so the fact that I was from Washington State, and he is a Washington State senator on this committee, that was kind of how I was able to get that job.
Marty, in learning a little bit more about you, you described your family losing the farm, losing the orchard. You described going off to school, and from a small-ish rural community, and then going to one of the biggest cities in the world in Washington D.C., about a center of power, working for Congress. I imagine that there had to be some struggles and some true challenges. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the challenges or struggles that you've had and how you overcame those in that part of your
Yeah,
life?
yeah. Um, the it was a real the experience in Washington D.C. was pretty challenging because it was I was pretty young and idealistic and thinking about that this was going to be a way to impact our world and impact our communities, and um, through good policy and funding programs and all that sort of good stuff. And even then, kind of what I mean by that is, that was probably like 35 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality was, the politics runs deep in that town, and it has for
Mm-hmm.
a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so it was that was the struggle that I went through, and that many people do, is kind of trying to connect those ideals of, how do we want to spend our life, and how do we want to invest our time with the realities of, you know, people playing politics and things getting either done or not done for reasons that are not what you might expect. So, so that was a real time for bigger personal decisions about how I wanted to spend time. And to be honest, Roger, I feel fortunate that I had that choice to make. It was a good job. It was a good opportunity. And I recognize that not everybody has the chance to choose whether you want to continue in that path or not. I decided to, and it was a bit of a risk because I didn't know what my future might hold if I chose to pursue economic development for lower income people, or affordable housing in underserved areas. But I'm glad I did, and is definitely a different path than had I stayed in DC, but it's a path I've really enjoyed and hopefully brought some value and benefit to my the partners and colleagues and communities that we work in.
You know, Marty, as you describe your life again, and you talk about this life of service, I mean, that's what I'm hearing service to a greater community, service to those who are really in need, those that are unhoused or need to be housed better. I mean, you go to college, you go to, you leave your community, you leave the comfort of your home and your homelands. Was there some person that inspired you to be of service? Because not everybody is cut out in the fabric of service. I mean, a lot of people are, don't operate that way. They don't think that way. It's not natural for them. And it seems to be that as you describe this is you had this North Star, and you were off pursuing, and at expense of your comfort and your comfort zones and whatnot. And was there somebody who inspired you to be of service?
There were a couple of people.
Okay.
The one who comes to mind most quickly is when I was in Philadelphia at Eastern. One of my professors was a guy named Dr. Anthony Campolo, or some call him Tony Campolo. He passed away recently, but he was inspirational for me. I not only had him as a professor, but it was in this graduate program where part of my financial aid was to be a graduate assistant, and he was the person I was assigned to work for. And he's a person who has a deep faith, and his faith really pushes him and those around him, including me, to focus on being of service. I appreciate you calling it out that way, Roger, because that's really what it's about treating people the way we would like to be treated, and focusing on trying to serve people in communities who've been left out and who've not had the same opportunities that many people have, and trying to help level that playing field. He was he in Philadelphia. He started a lot of this is tied to the economic development element that we were about before, but he helped start this program that I helped work on while I was there. It was called Urban Promise, and it was a small screen printing shop where it was aimed at as an employment program for kids who had dropped out of high school. And we made T-shirts and greeting cards and all sorts of stuff. And I was working kind of in the back office, on budgets and marketing and things like that. But it was also, helping show young people just kind of some of the fundamentals about a job, showing up on time, being ready to work, and things like that. And Campolo started that and pushed me to, do all I could to help it make it be successful. And so, yeah, he's a great guy. I was sad at his passing, but he lived a long and influential life, and I'm one of the people who was influenced by his work.
Well, Marty, I mean, my understanding at this point in my life is don't be sad, be happy, because he's unbound and, not limited anymore. And he's living through you and with you. And, that deep faith that he had continues to live through you. So, Anthony Capolo is, he's here and well. Look at him. He's on the screen right now.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Roger. That's a really valuable way to think about it.
Yeah. Kind of going from there and so inspiring. And, hearing you talk about, your family and your migration and your path that you're on, this journey that you've experienced, and kind of where you are right now. What makes rural and farm worker housing unique? I mean, when you think about housing, there's that little kid with a crayon, and you draw the house with a pitch roof and a little smokestack and, stick people figures. And, so we learned very early that housing is, it's there and everybody has housing, that's the fiction, right? And so when you think about even housing more specifically around rural communities and even more specific around the farm worker housing, you know, what makes that so unique?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, initially, what comes to my mind, Roger, with what makes it unique is the what has not existed, and what by that I mean, many rural communities have a very limited housing stock, and it's often poor quality. People who live there often have, because of its condition, they have more health problems.
Mm-hmm.
Asthma, for example, can be run rampant in communities where the housing is in poor condition. Um, even poor housing and overcrowded conditions, folks can spend way too much of their income, and so it's not affordable and it's of poor quality. So those are a lot of the unique elements that exist in many rural communities, unfortunately. And so we have an opportunity to do something about that through creating quality, affordable housing for whether it's for farm workers or the general population or seniors or whoever it might be. Um, I'd be happy to tell you more too about kind of the scope and scale of projects. Is that kind of what you had in mind thinking about what
Yeah,
makes
I absolutely would love to hear about that. But before we jump into that, just kind of trying to define rural. I mean, how would you define rural, and then how would you define farm worker housing in relative to other kinds of housing? How would you define
yeah.
rural?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not an easy question. We tend to use population,
Okay.
like as a rough definition, like 35, a community of 35,000 or less.
Okay.
That's kind of a general thing that we use, as a preliminary assessment. Um, and a lot of the communities that we work in are much smaller than that, could be 5 or 10,000, and in fact, some that might be 1,000 or fewer. So usually it's population based to define what's rural. For farm worker housing, um, we've actually started trying to use the term workforce housing
Mm.
more recently because that's what it is. This is housing for people who are employed and working in their communities. Um, it often lines up with those same rural communities because a lot of the agriculture is in smaller towns and outside of urban areas, of course. Although we do like as you mentioned, I live and work in Yakima. Yakima is a bigger city within central Washington. We're close to 100,000 people. So there will also be, we'll do affordable housing and farm worker or workforce housing in Yakima. Um, and people will just then, drive to the communities that they're working in.
Yeah, I was kind of struck by that as you defined rural. Talking about 3,500 and even down to 1,000. I would make the assumption that the 1,000 person rural community has less options than the 35, and certainly a lot less than the 100,000 in the city of Yakima that's growing very fast. So it would seem like the emphasis in the work maybe would be even more important in this much smaller communities because they have less options. Is that correct?
That's absolutely true. And
Okay.
another reality that many of those smaller communities face is that the developers, like the for-profit, market developers who are out there creating housing, they're not typically looking in those smallest communities.
Hmm.
They're they have more access to subcontractors and the products and everything, and higher profit margins in bigger communities.
Hmm.
Even in Yakima, that's something that we struggle with a bit, is because some developers, if they go over to the west side of the state in Seattle and the Puget Sound area, they can build a similar size housing or home with not significantly different costs of construction, but charge a lot more for it. So the profit margin can be bigger in urban areas. Costs can be larger too, but oftentimes, there's more incentive, which also leads back to your point of there are just fewer options in rural communities, and in our experience, at least in rural Washington, fewer active um, businesses and organizations that are trying to build new housing in smaller communities.
I was telling you a little bit about my my Northwest background and experiences there in the '70s, and seeing the little community inside the city of Seattle, Ballard, and seeing Ballard transform from this little kind of closed knit community. And then now Ballard is, you're not going to get a house for not much under $1 million now.
Yeah, right,
And my
right.
parents bought their first house for $16,000, and that same house
Yeah,
is, well over a million, million and a half now. It's the same house. It's just
yeah,
incredible what Seattle has done with its growth. And then, right next to Seattle, there's Yakima, and right next to Yakima are even smaller, little towns and communities where all the fruit and vegetables come from. So where does Seattle, Portland, and other bigger cities think their food is coming from, and how are those people housed? And again, I just commend you on this important work you're doing.
that you triggered another story I wanted to share with you, Roger, and that is, one of the things that happened as a result of COVID, or it kind of, I think it started moving forward more quickly, is the remote work. And so Seattle and Ballard and those surrounding communities are very expensive places to live. And so what we saw was a lot of people who had the means and resources, they left those communities and they moved to Central Washington.
Hmm.
And that also increases housing pressure here because they often have higher incomes. They're able to buy homes or rent their place and have the resources to do that. And that is fine. I mean, that's just the way the world works, but it also can put more pressure on existing housing. A friend of mine, are you familiar with Wenatchee, a couple hours north of us?
Yeah, very much so. Hmm.
Yeah. So a friend of mine worked in Wenatchee. Um, this was just prior to COVID. He got a job opportunity in Texas. So he sold his home, decided to move. He and his family moved to Texas, worked there for a couple of years, and the job wasn't what he had hoped it would be. And he wanted to move back to Wenatchee. This was like 2 years later. And and he couldn't find a place to live. In that 2 year period, the market had changed so dramatically that he couldn't move back because he couldn't find a place that he had just moved from 2 years earlier. And their home prices and rental rates skyrocketed, and that's happened in Yakima to some degree too. And so it's just putting increased pressure on a lot of communities because the people who are at the lowest end of the economic scale have the fewest options. Um, and so they're the ones who, in my opinion, get impacted the most, whether it's Yakima or Wapato or Wenatchee or wherever it may be.
Well, And you just spelled out the need for more Martys. Yeah.
Right.
You talked about the projects, but before we get into the projects, can you tell me a little bit more about some of the organizations that you are currently involved with, just kind of at a higher level?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned RCAC, Rural
Hmm.
Community Assistance Corporation. I'm on their board of directors. That's a volunteer position. That's a great organization. I've really been fortunate to serve in that capacity. They are doing some really innovative work around water and wastewater in rural communities. They're really doing some innovative stuff around lending, and particularly in indigenous communities. And they also have housing work that they do, including, we may talk about it later, but they have a program specifically developed for creating tribal housing. It's called the Tribal Housing Excellence Academy. So anyway, so RCAC has been it's been a great opportunity for me, and I've really appreciated being able to be involved. I'm also a member of the National Rural Housing Coalition, where I still try to do that policy work we were talking about earlier to try to advocate for resources that serve rural communities. And there's another organization called the National Farmworker Housing Directors Association that I am the current vice president of, that also tries to prioritize and advocate for programs and resources that serve the farm worker community and housing within the farm worker community.
Marty, are you still getting the same kind of joy and fulfillment on the policy stuff you're working on today that you were, kind of back in the previous days of your life in Washington, D.C.? I mean, do you still
Uh,
feel like, that the policy piece can be really impactful in changing, people's lives and changing, and economics at a much broader scale? I mean, do you still
yeah.
have hopes that policy is a, place that needs work and can, have, impactful, benefits?
Yeah, I do. I do. I'm not sure joy is still part of the statement, but but yeah, I absolutely do. I think it makes a difference. I'll give you an example.
Sure.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture has something they call the Agricultural Outlook Forum, and they've been doing this for over 100 years, where they get together and talk about, what the future looks like for the agricultural industry. And for the first time that I'm aware of, they decided to have a session about housing and workforce housing
Hmm.
as a piece of this puzzle. And that was just this February. And so they invited me to be a panelist on that. And I said yes, because I wanted to bring the message that you and I are talking about, that there are federal resources that are needed and can make a difference in local communities. And I think it's especially valuable right now when, we're in a world of, it's a topsy-turvy world we're living in right now. And the what the federal investment is going to be is very uncertain. And so I think it's important, for those of us who are believe in and are dedicated to this work, to speak up about it and show how this can make a difference, and it's an important investment, and makes our communities stronger. So anyway, so I am still involved, and I believe it's needed, and I'm not always sure what the outcome is going to be, but try to keep bringing those messages.
You talk about topsy turvy and really unpredictable times and uncertainty here. It's almost a little, well, with some interpretation about asking this question. Do we need housing? Do we need workforce housing for migrant labor? If in fact, do we have migrant labor?
That's a great question. It's changing quickly.
Hmm.
You know, when I started working in this job, you know, which was now over 30 years ago, the general demographics of or rule of thumb was that, you know, if you, at least for Washington State, if you think about the farm worker population as a whole, about 60% of that population was local people, you know, people who lived in the community on a
Hmm.
year-round basis and they worked in ag. And about 40% were migrant farm workers, you know, that may start in California or Texas or
Hmm.
Mexico or wherever, you know, and they follow the crops during the season. Well, over the course of the years that I've been looking at these numbers, that's probably that grew to closer to like 80% to 20%. So 80% living in the communities and 20% being migrant. I think it's probably shrinking even further now. You know, and although, are you familiar with there's a guest worker program, it's called the H-2A
Hmm.
program.
Yep. Yep.
That program is increasing in Washington State. And so from that perspective, you know, there are, if you want to call that a migrant workers who are in communities on a temporary basis, you know, we are seeing a increase in the number of employers who are using the H-2A program, and there's housing demand being driven by that. Um, but I think you make a really good point, Roger, that the things are changing quickly. And I mean, I'll give you another example, and feel free to, you know, take this in a different direction if I'm getting off track. But I was talking with one of our partners who provides both, um, well, we call it seasonally occupied housing for migrant workers or permanent housing for people who live in their community on a year-round basis. So this organization provides both permanent and seasonal housing. And on their permanent housing, they're starting to experience uh, higher than expected vacancy rates because people are scared.
Mm-hmm.
They're concerned about you know, what's going to happen to them and their family, and some are choosing to move and leave. And so anyway, all that is to say, you know, it's a time of big change. I know there's ag is still a big agriculture is still a big economic engine that needs a workforce. I'm convinced there's still going to be housing demand, but how that looks is in a real state of flux right now.
You know, when you talk about the fear that the migrant workforce has, and rightfully so, I'm sure. I think for us who are not migrant farm workers,
Right.
that fear, the domino effect of that fear of that farm worker, no farm, no food. You know, but it's almost invisible to us during this season, you know, during the spring season, during the winter season. And when does that fear come home to us that are not migrant farm workers? And when do we start experiencing the fear that they have when those grocery store shelves are empty, when the bins of foodstuffs are no longer there, and the farm owners and the financiers and the people who have loans and grants and whatnot, equipment, and you know that comes home to roost. Like now this fall during harvest seasons,
Hmm.
the plural seasons. And it's like I think we're all going to start to experience what that migrant farm worker experience was, that fear. And when we go to the grocery store and the fear of no food in that grocery store,
Yeah, right.
I think we're going to share that fear that they have.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that too.
Yeah, it's a domino effect of that fear.
Yeah, yeah.
You said in your background that you've worked around tribes and indigenous communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of your experiences with tribal communities?
Sure, yeah. And it's been fairly limited just to,
Mhm.
so I don't want to make it sound like more than it is, but we have worked we're currently working with the Yakima Nation, in fact, or with several of their members who are the initial effort is to try to create some transitional housing for tribal members who don't have access to a reasonable place to live. They've either are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. So we are acting as their a technical assistance consultant to help do things like assess the land that they want to use for this development, help get a, a concrete development plan in place with to install infrastructure and the eventual housing. And we're also assisting with securing the financing to get that done. So that's our initial effort. We're also in early discussions, also with the Yakima Nation about skilled workforce housing.
Hmm.
There's a program through the HUD that is for this type of housing specifically for tribal housing entities. So that's just getting underway, but we're excited about that opportunity too, and have are developing some really valuable relationships with the leadership and members within the Yakima Nation.
Marty, how does your indigenous experience relative to the non-indigenous experience? I mean, how is it different working with indigenous communities relative to working with non-indigenous communities? Is there some glaring difference or some one piece of it that makes it very different?
I think there are definitely differences, and the one that I feel most aware of is that that there are different cultures and different values,
Mm.
and that I don't have firsthand experience with, uh, and so but I'm respectful of that, and so what that translates to in kind of in more detailed terms is that, for example, like with this transitional housing, it's really important for us to know uh, what the tribe wants it to look like and how it will best serve their members. And so it's not, I want to help try to then provide assistance to achieve their vision, but it's important for, I believe, for me not to think that I have to I have to have the vision or I have to, influence where they want to go. Um, in some other communities, that are non-indigenous, they may want more direction about, should this be an apartment building or should it, what should the units look like or how to, it's a little more conventional, I guess I would say, from a development perspective. But I think the kind of the acknowledging and trying to be of service to those cultural differences is really important. Decision making is a big piece of that too, Roger, where we want to provide information and options, but ultimately, it's the tribe that makes the decision on what we do or don't do. And so those are some of the pieces that I've observed that we're trying to be aware of and respectful of.
Just to press a little bit further, and I'll leave it alone after this, is, use words like value and culture as a differential. Can you give voice to, like, what is the difference of a tribal value that makes housing different, or what's different about a tribal culture, whether it's decision making or timing or something else that makes it different than use the word conventional housing? What's the difference in the value and the culture from your perspective?
Yeah. Um, I think, again, my experience is limited, so
Hmm.
I know I have a lot to learn. But I think in a non-indigenous context, we might have a person or someone who just says, "This is the way, this is what I want done, and this is when I want it done," and is very, kind of directive in that. In our work with the Yakima Nation, I see more collaboration. I see more of the people that we're most in contact with, the staff, wanting to make sure that they're communicating clearly with the tribal council and that the tribal council has an opportunity to consider what is being done and whether they're supportive or not. So I think it's a broader community um, perspective of just wanting to make sure that not only the staff but leadership are on board and in agreement with what's being done, rather than just like one person or one entity calling the shots and running with it. If I'm does that I hope that distinction is making some sense.
It does. We summarize that. We call it Indian time. Things
Uh,
things seem to work on a different time basis. I mean, truly, we laugh about it and we joke about it, but we also acknowledge it's true. Because when you
yeah,
think about the measure three times to cut once, not measure twice, but measure three times to cut once.
yeah,
When you think about that, what's the benefit of the measuring three times to cut the one? Is because I think a lot of the tribes, in terms of its decision making, you could be the mayor of Seattle, you can be the city councilor of Ellensburg, or sit on some elected position at Yakima. And if it didn't work out, you can easily move. In Indian country, if you're a tribal leader, you don't move. It's home. I mean, it's not just your home; it's your family, it's your church, it's your cemetery, it's your future. So I think that there's this sense of, wanting to make sure that we do it and do it right, and that just takes more time
yeah.
that way. And then we summarize that as Indian country and say, "But geez, it would be great if we could move faster because Indian country is growing 4% per year, doubling every 25 years or so. Our growth rate." And that's not migrants coming into our community. That's organic growth,
Yeah,
just the natural growth of our tribal communities. And so tribal leaders sometimes just feel like they can't make a mistake, because they're going to forever be held with that project, that mistake, that funding, that decision, that policy was a mistake. And I think there's some, measuring three times to make sure you get that right.
mhm, yeah,
I keep looking past you at this amazingly beautiful picture, this poster that you've got. It's the 30th anniversary celebration, 30 years. And
yeah,
that's the Office of Rural and Farm Worker
yeah,
Housing poster. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and maybe even getting into some of the projects?
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
actually, believe it or not, that poster is older, but I really like it, so I've kept it.
Oh, I like
We're
it
now
too.
we just hit our 45th
Oh my
anniversary.
goodness. Yeah. No, no,
Yeah,
it's a very artistic poster. I really like it a lot.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did too. I thought it was worth keeping.
Hmm.
Uh, Yeah, so we got our start organizationally in the late 70s, with a group of people that saw the bad housing conditions in many communities and decided they wanted to do something about it. And so created this organization, ORF, as we refer to it in shorthand, to be to help create affordable housing. One of the key decisions our early leaders of the organization made was that we always wanted to work in partnership with local communities. And so that means we're not an owner or a direct operator of housing ourselves. We partner with community organizations, nonprofits, sometimes employers who want to address the housing needs in their community. And so we provide the development expertise, to help go from a concept of what may need to be done or what they're hoping to achieve to actually creating housing and having people move in and start to live their life in a new, affordable, well-built place.
So is that the
So
visioning all the way through the development process to opening the door and, for housing itself?
we're involved in the whole process. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Is that
Yeah.
exclusive to Washington? Do you guys only do that work in Washington State?
That's our priority. We've just started branching out a bit further. We're providing some assistance to a group in Oregon now, but our primary focus is the state of Washington.
The country needs you. Are there other organizations that do this kind of work?
Yeah, we have done some more technical assistance in a broader way. So I think if people are outside of Washington are interested in that, we could have a conversation and see what might be possible.
There's 570 or so federally recognized Indian tribes across 33 states. I think a lot of tribes will be interested in that model. And talking about that model, do you charge? I mean, how does the organization stay functional? Do you charge
Yeah.
for those services?
Well, essentially, yes.
Okay.
In Washington, there's a few different paths. In Washington State, for organizations that are new to housing, we were able to get a contract, technical assistance contract with the state of Washington support, where we can provide assistance to organizations at no charge to the organization. So we can cover some of the initial costs, like refining their concept or doing preliminary project feasibility to see if what they're envisioning, is buildable and can operate. So we can do some of that work at no cost to the local organization because of the support through the state of Washington. The other ways that if it's an organization that's not eligible for that, then we often have some preliminary conversations with folks at no charge, just to try to understand who they are and what they're trying to achieve and share who we are and what we can provide to see if there's a match. If there is a match, we can often then say, okay, well, here's a fee for service agreement, where we identify the things that they want to achieve, and we negotiate an hourly rate, and it's pretty straightforward.
What
Uh,
percentage of your work is the fee for service versus like paying attention to your own work?
I would say fee for service is maybe, 25 to 35%
Hmm.
of our work.
No, that's
Um,
significant, actually.
yeah. The bigger piece too is when an organization has found that they've achieved their feasibility, they've identified who they want to serve, and there appears to be a path forward. Then they can also hire us as their developer, and so that will then get us. We will assist throughout the process, however long that process may take. And so that can include the other elements of finalizing, construction plans and assembling the financing and overseeing construction and all those details, that get to a completed development that people can move into. And when it goes to that stage, then there's a different fee structure that we negotiate with whoever our client is, that has financing as our fee is a piece of the total financing associated with the development.
Does the office actually manage properties?
We do not.
Oh, okay. Who
No.
does that?
Well, that depends. We have a lot of third-party partners that we've worked with that are property management companies. Some of the organizations we work for have their own property management in-house, and they do it themselves.
Hmm.
So So we walk through those decisions with the organizations we're working for to see if they want to hire somebody or if they want to do it internally, and get those plans in place.
We talked about the variances between seasonal and year round. How do you help a client make the decision? Is it a hybrid? Is it a mix? Is it one or the other? How do you help the decision process for clients to be able to make those kind of decisions?
Yeah, that's another really good question. The, I mean, it all starts with their vision of who they're trying to serve and provide housing for. So some may say, we have our permanent workforce that, we have, they might say we have families, that we're trying to serve and we have 10 families, or they may say, we're big into the H2A program and we're going to have 100 people for 6 months, or, so the initial stage is to try to do a deep dive with that organization or that community and to say, to really clearly understand who do you want to serve, what's the scale, could it be 5 units or 50 units or 500 units? And then also what is the kind of the demographics of the people that you hope to provide housing for? Is it single individuals? Is it families? How much do they earn roughly so we can figure out what is affordable and what isn't? So we have a deep dive into those, a deep dive discussion into those types of questions. So we can all make sure we're thinking about it in the same way of, what needs to be created at the end of this process that is going to most benefit, who you're trying to provide housing for.
Yeah, so you just described some pretty comprehensive pre-construction services. It seems like that's squarely in the middle of your wheelhouse, so to speak, in terms of services. Do you get involved in, beyond that in terms of design review or building material selection and, the actual construction, those kinds of things?
We do,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's a great, opportunity, and that's where, different areas and different communities have different building preferences, different material choices. Um, you know, with what little I know about New Mexico, I know there's some really unique and interesting building styles and materials that suit the culture and the climate very well,
Hmm.
that are very different than the Pacific Northwest.
I
So
don't think Adobe would last very well in that Seattle drizzle.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So we help. Sometimes it's helping pick an architect or an engineer, to bring in some detailed expertise. We also do, there's some real value in community engagement,
Hmm.
or so that, the people who will be living in the housing in the future are involved in the decision making at the outset. Um, there's a term I learned a few years ago from an architect friend, that he called it a design charrette,
Hmm.
where, and that was, you've probably heard of it.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
basically the idea of you try to, intentionally bring a lot of people into the discussion to hear about ideas, and goals and things to avoid, so that when you're at those early stages of thinking about what can this look like and how should it be built, and that you get good input so that you wind up with a better product at the end.
It would sound like the need for rural and farm worker housing is so great and critically needed. What does a typical farm working housing project schedule look like? I mean, can you build fast enough to keep up with the demand?
Yeah, that's another very good question. Uh, the short answer is no.
Okay.
Timing wise, if things are going really well, we think it's at least a 3-year process from going from a concept to actual buildings ready to for people to move in. And unfortunately, it can often be longer than that.
Hmm.
There's a lot of things that can trip you up along the way. That could be construction pricing or, can be a whole supply chain problems. All sorts of things can come up to lengthen that time frame. But yeah, unfortunately, this is a process that commonly takes many years.
Yeah. What does the technical assistance support look like that you offer?
Yeah, it's usually oriented toward the very early stages of development. So generally that might mean we were talking a little bit about a deep dive on the concept, and who you're trying to serve and what it would look like. Once that's complete, the next step of technical assistance is what we call feasibility. And that's where we also once the concept is defined, we start making a variety of assumptions about the number of homes you're trying to build and what the size will be and what rent you may be able to charge. So at the end of the feasibility process, we would have a preliminary look at what's it going to cost to build and what's it going to cost to operate. And then our client will make a decision of whether they're comfortable with that or not. If they are comfortable, then we proceed and continue on the development process. But if they're not, and we've had this happen, some folks will say, well, this isn't what we thought it was going to be, or this is a bigger obligation than we're able to take on right now, and so they choose to not go forward. But that's the value of doing feasibility, so that people can make an informed decision early in the process about whether they want to continue or not.
I'm a client, and you got me at the pre-construction, at the charrette, and all the beautiful pictures, the renderings, and kind of I can see the big community picture that you painted, and so the feasibility is there. Now comes the tough part. I mean, how do I get capital financing funding? How do I actually turn that charrette into some kind of reality, and can I afford it? That's where the rubber starts meeting the road, and it gets a little tough having that
Yeah,
conversation. How do you support clients with the funding, financing, and access to capital?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it starts to get more difficult.
Hmm.
Within the feasibility process, we do try to identify the likely sources of capital, that's going to fit the desired goal. So if there's no if it's people, if it's an organization trying to uh, create housing that for a group that there's no real clear path forward for financing, then we're probably going to say we don't think this is feasible. Um, but if there is, we want to identify those sources of capital. There's also another factor that folks need to consider early on, Roger, is we call them pre-development expenses.
Hmm.
So, for example, let's say we've gone through the feasibility process and the group would like to proceed, and they may need to buy a piece of land. Well, there's going to likely need to be some funding to secure the land, like an earnest money deposit. Then there's going to be some environmental review. There might be some preliminary architectural plans. Those are all kind of upfront expenses that need to be covered just to kind of get the concept launched a little further. So discussing where those pre-development funds are going to come from and how much they might be is another important early discussion. that then leads to evaluating the permanent sources of capital. And then we get into, that could be federal funds, it might be state funds, it could be private funds, or in many cases, all of the above.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the environment today, with access to federal funds versus, private or, foundation or, other kinds of investments. It would seem like that is really going to be a drastic change in the landscape, from what all, kind of current indicators tell us about access to federal funding. Is the office you guys are a CDFI?
We are,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So plenty of experience in that area, and then helping to manage risk and, project development. How do you support clients in managing that risk, especially in today's environment?
Yeah. The yeah, it's really challenging. It's getting tricky. But essentially, what we try to do is um, identify the sources that we think are gonna, most likely work to create a development, and then have some early conversations with those sources of financing, to see about if they anticipate, that these funds will be available. Um, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they have some programs that are specifically for farm worker housing. They can either be used by a property owner to create housing on their property, or by a community group. Um, those those funds are under pressure right now. But as I've been talking to some of the leadership within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who we work with on housing stuff, um, they anticipate they're still going to be there and be available, maybe in a lower figure, but that it's not going away entirely. So it's having those kinds of conversations so we can try to give really detailed, concrete recommendations to our client to say, here's what we think the path forward is, and try to assess, like, are you comfortable spending the money to, say, buy the land or get an environmental assessment and stuff like that, with, this set of assumptions, as the financing that's going to pay for it all in the future.
So we think about the usual partners, USDA, now there's HUD, and we know that there's going to be changes there. Are there new prospective partners that can come in and backfill in your mind? I mean, is there foundations? Is there private capital? Is there access to, is there just a different source that you consider?
Yeah, we're working on that. I think in Washington State, there are some state resources that are really valuable. There's one called the Housing Trust Fund that has been a really great investment by the state in affordable housing. But unfortunately, not every state has that kind of resource.
Right.
There are, we've you mentioned community development financial institutions.
Hmm.
Those can be some valuable partners too. They're most likely debt, and one of the big challenges that we face in rural communities and tribal communities is that for the people that we're trying to serve, incomes are often pretty low. And so the ability to fund, to make debt payments is limited. So it's a good resource that needs to be evaluated. But in our experience anyway, it's often not a big resource just because of the limitations of the incomes of the people that we're trying to serve, and that it's just hard to create enough revenue that can make that monthly debt payment if it's any significant amount.
You know, this is very important work that you do, and you're not doing it in a bubble. You're not doing it isolated. You're doing it in in Washington State. You're doing it in cities like Yakima, the city, and Yakima Nation, the tribe. How do you engage with the broader housing ecosystems? Because it seems like the tide raises all ships, or the sinking of all the ships. Kind of like you're in this together with a number of other folks. Do you find yourself communicating differently or more often with the greater ecosystem of housing?
Yeah, we do. And that also relates back to the policy discussion we were having earlier. We really do try to engage with those broader conversations so that people recognize the needs in a wide variety of communities and how um, investment can really be beneficial in a very broad way. I'll give you an example. As we work in the state of Washington, um, Seattle and Puget Sound communities, they're big, they're politically influential, and all that sort of stuff. But we try to intentionally engage with housing providers there and with our state legislature to say, this is a big, diverse state. And yes, Seattle needs to investment in their communities, but so does White Swan.
Hmm.
So does Sunnyside.
Hmm.
And fortunately, people recognize, that there are diverse needs throughout the state, and that these funds and these resources need to be able to address a variety of needs. But it's important that I believe it's important that we and other groups that are like us are in those discussions to raise those issues, or else we can be forgotten about, and not see the investment that kind of more politically well-connected groups might.
You know that ancient Chinese symbol of the yin and the yang, and change and opportunity, challenge and opportunity all at the same time. Are you seeing that there's opportunities now in this kind of a very diverse and challenging time that we're in for strange bedfellows, unique partnerships, and private developers with kind of development that you're considering and have been working on? Are there opportunities now like never before in terms of kind of forcing this change, kind of forcing you new and distinct opportunities that might never have been there before?
Yeah, I think there are. I
Hmm.
think, for example, we come from our history is as a service organization, trying to help uh, people and communities that have been kind of left out. But I think in this new environment, one of the things that we're thinking more about and pursuing is like partnerships with employers in communities, because we have a lot of commonality. They need a workforce to be able to provide their product or provide their service. And a thing that we've been able to reach some common ground on with a lot of employers is they recognize people need a place to live. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to explore is what can those partnerships with employers look like to meet our mutual interests of housing, both because it's the right thing to do for people, but also because employers need a workforce, and that workforce needs a place to live.
Are there things that you can borrow from Seattle, the Seattle area, Amazon, Microsoft, and their bedroom communities of the bigger cities like that, and kind of lessons learned? Is there when you're working with your prospective employers about workforce housing? Are there really good lessons to be learned from the Seattle experience with Amazon and Microsoft?
I think there are, they're making big investments in housing in the Seattle and Puget Sound area for the reasons that we've been talking about. So I think from from a competitiveness standpoint, the having the workforce with that has a place to live is a strong selling point. Some other elements are more kind of practical in the development world. And what I mean by that is we've been rethinking some of our design elements. For example, costs continue to rise for construction, and so how do we try to control for that? Well, in the Seattle area, they've done a lot with um, tiny homes, smaller square
Hmm.
footage, but still very livable spaces. And if you can reduce the size of the construction footprint, then you can bring costs down. So we're trying to see how we can adopt some of those practices, try to tailor them to the communities that we work in to make sure that people will still want to live there, but also help bring the cost down and make it a more affordable place in the end.
Well, I think not only in terms of the design, but also in terms of energy efficiency and
Yeah.
insulation, et cetera. How do you address the energy efficiency, modular housing, those kinds of things that might fall into that energy savings on a pre-design basis?
Yeah. That's another very good question. We try to build that in very early on
Hmm.
because the you're absolutely right. Energy and water can be big drivers in the costs of operation. A couple of years ago, with one of our clients that we've done a lot of work for, they were finding some of their housing developments were operating in the black and self-sustaining, and some were operating in the red and losing money, but they were very similar. So they were, it was confusing as to why one was doing well and the other wasn't. And so they decided to do a deeper dive into what was going on. And they found an unexpected result, and that is, and this is in Central Washington again, but on the ones that were having operating trouble, the more lawn they had, the more likely they were to be in the negative because that lawn required irrigation and water. Most of these developments are not on a well, that has kind of an unregulated supply of water, so they have to pay for their water use. Plus, it requires a lot more maintenance and mowing and all that sort of stuff over the course of the year. And so what that led to was they adopted moving forward a very different landscaping plan where they weren't having these big patches of grass, that have been common in a lot of areas, but they were incorporating more plants that were native to the area and in our context, they're used to hot, dry climate in the summer and cold, snowy winters,
Hmm.
and so they're drought tolerant and that sort of stuff. And then using more like xeriscaping where there's rocks and things like that that still look attractive, but it's different than, kind of the manicured lawn that a lot of people picture. But that was a cost driver. And I thought that was really valuable research, that could have a practical result and still have an attractive development, but that was more likely to be able to be financially self-sustaining.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. How does immigration policy it's front and center. Every newspaper, every newscast, we're talking about immigration policy, and then the farm worker legal status impact your work. I mean, I think I asked that question a little bit earlier, in the interview about, is there even a need? Because are there clients that are there, you know, migrant farm workers? So can you speak a little bit more about that in terms of the immigration policy that's going on, not just nationally, but internationally now as we're, starting to get a better sense for what's happening out there, and then how that impacts your work?
Yeah, it's definitely changing. I think we're still seeing interest in people approaching our organization about doing trying to create farm worker housing, but it's different than what it may have looked like even 5 years ago, or definitely different than 10 or 20 years ago. And what I mean by that is, um, I still think there's going to be an ongoing demand for permanent year-round farm worker housing, workforce housing,
Hmm.
because agriculture is a strong component of communities and an economic engine, and there needs and just as a overall um, housing supply issue, many communities are in short supply, and farm workers often have the fewest options. So I'm convinced that part is still going to be in demand going into the future. The migrant element and kind of the seasonal occupancy is the piece that I anticipate changing the most,
Hmm.
where, we may see hardly any what years ago we might have thought of as traditional migrant farm workers, who might, follow the seasons from southern areas to northern areas, as crops grow and are harvested. The trends were already in place that group was declining, and I think it was now with our current um, administration's policy about enforcement and migration, that sort of stuff. I think there's going to be continue to be downward pressure on people who are able and willing to migrate. I think it may be um, counterbalanced a bit by the H-2A guest worker program, and that I wouldn't be surprised if that continues to grow. And and you may know this already, Roger, so forgive me if this is redundant, but if people are if an employer is contracting for H-2A workers, they're required to provide housing, and they have to show prior to the arrival of the guest worker that the housing is committed and it's reserved. So because they don't want to, just bring a bunch of people in and then have them fend for themselves when it comes to housing. So I think we may see more investment that way for employers who are doing um, H-2A guest worker housing. But we're really in a time of change, and so it's going to be interesting to see what this looks like in another 5 or 10 years.
Looking at this change that we're in through the eyes of an eighth grader, where the migrants are no longer coming, you got unemployed, people in unemployment pretty high, homelessness. Will the American, not the migrant, will the American unemployed, homeless backfill where the migrant left off and, work that hard in the agricultural sector and need housing?
That's a great question, and I don't know. My honest answer is I don't think so.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
you
what
know,
does history say?
yeah, right, right. I mean, I think um, we worked with a group. This is also probably now 10 or 15, 10 or 12 years ago. They're an association of employers, They had like 400 jobs that they needed to fill that were farm work jobs. So they did, and they were trying to do it, fill those jobs without using the H-2A program.
Hmm.
So they did a real marketing blitz, on radio, and this was, some internet stuff. Social media wasn't as big then as it was now, but did some pretty intensive outreach to try to encourage people, kind of the local workforce who might not have considered farm work, and say, hey, look, we're going to train you. We grow a lot of apples here. We're going to show you how to climb a ladder safely. We're going to teach you how to prune, teach you how to pick an apple, all that sort of stuff. They needed 400 jobs. I think they got 12 applicants.
Why? It's
And
only 110 degrees out, and you're only having to climb ladders with a 40-pound pack of apples and climb up and down. And I mean, why would they only get 12 workers willing to do something like that?
exactly. So it's hard work, it's demanding work, and it can be dangerous work.
Hmm.
There are lots of injuries can happen.
Hmm.
So I'm now at the same time, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, Roger. I was able to, I think your website is really great. I learned about some of the agricultural efforts that your family and your communities are involved in. That as you mentioned earlier, you're not migrants, and I don't think you're relying on. My impression is you're not relying on migrant labor. But from what I'm curious as to, your thoughts about how our current environment might be impacting your community, and maybe there's not much of an impact, but especially with the agricultural element, what are your thoughts about, kind of the short term or more immediate impact on agriculture as you see it?
I think for me, and thank you for asking the question in a conversational kind of way, that the cherry on the top for us is these policy points that are coming out, and we're all having to, as humanity and as U.S. citizens, we're all having to deal with this. We've already been dealing with the cultural changes within our tribal community on a generational basis. We've been dealing with the environmental impacts on a generational basis. So, in my community, we had 1,500 acres of irrigated acres of wheat, sheep, orchards. We have no sheep, we have no wheat, and we have no orchards. We still have 500 acres or so of farming. And on a generational basis, social impacts and whatnot, it's really changing. And we kind of feel like in some ways we're the minor canary. I mean, I think the American Indian community, people talk about colonization of these United States and various cultures. So I think for the Midwest farmer who's losing his farm, his tractor, his loan, his grant, we've already been decolonized because we were never colonized. We didn't have access to those loans. We didn't have access to those that equipment and that grant and that financing. So in terms of being the minor canary, I mean, look at your future. When the Midwestern farmer looks at their trouble and say, "Oh, geez, this world is changing." Look to an Indian community, and that's your future.
Yeah.
So I think that Indian tribes in general have been very resilient in many ways. But yeah, I mean, as a farmer, I went to some of the federal programs and they said I'm not eligible. I didn't know what a landscape architect was. That was not part of my vocabulary. I didn't have the ability to write a grant or fill out the federal applications, and I didn't have anybody on the other side of the desk asking me or helping me or be in the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing, with pre-construction services, and of service like Marty is willing to help me. So I ended up just doing it myself. And there's not a lot of American Indians who are, have the ability to self-finance. In Indian housing, quite honestly, before the some of the policy changes, we were swiping our credit cards at not 18%, not 12%, 30% based on credit history. We'd go down to Home Depot and swipe our credit card, and we were financing our homes at 30, 35% interest. I don't know another American who would have a mortgage interest rate at 35%.
Yeah,
People talk
right.
about their 5% and complain about it. It's like, what's to complain about? Geez, we're doing it at 35%. So I think in a way, we have been what people's future is going to look like. We've been doing that for a very long time ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate your perspective, and um, it's yeah, it's a real challenge.
Hmm. Yep.
One of the things we've been talking about a little more that I'd also be interested in your perspective on if we have time.
Sure.
We again with the Yakima Nation, we're after the transitional housing that is our top priority with them. They're looking at workforce housing. And there's a HUD resource that helps builds, they called it skilled worker housing. It's Section 184 within HUD's programs. And what I think is unique about it, Roger, and this is the part I wanted to get your feedback on, is the scale. A lot of times when we think about scale and affordable housing, we think bigger. We got to go bigger, try to
Hmm.
achieve economies of scale. Instead of 20 units, we need to do 50 units or that sort of thing.
Hmm.
We're in this different environment, we're starting to think about maybe we need to be looking in the other direction.
Hmm.
What
Smaller.
if we can build 2 units or
Hmm.
4 units and then do that again and again, and go smaller scale but more repetition
Hmm.
to achieve it. So how does that resonate with you and like the not only the agriculture and the Pueblo, but also the housing needs?
Yeah, there's a very interesting case study that's going on right now. It's called San Felipe Pueblo, located between Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, right off of I-25. And they did exactly what you just suggested: was start off
Hmm.
at a couple at a time, and they had to go into the community, build financial literacy because of that 35% credit card, and get that credit card down to like 15%, something more reasonable. And so they had to start with financial literacy. They started building homes a couple at a time. They had to get 184 mortgages a couple at a time.
Hmm.
And today they're building homes at 50, 60 development, 50, 60 unit developments
Wow.
going at
Yeah.
a time. But that experiment's been going on for the last 20 years, and it's amazing. And
Hmm.
if San Felipe Pueblo can do it, nothing special there. I mean, any tribe can do it.
Yeah.
So we have some case studies in Indian country that make sense and speak to the volume that you're talking about. But instead of going big, because there's inertia, we talked about Indian time and measuring 3 times to cut once on a large project like that. But kind of taking a bite at a time and looking at a couple of homes, smaller, and then building the confidence. And really, I think that's our primary issue and our primary obstacle in the Indian country is self confidence.
Hmm.
And so having that self confidence with repetition and building that self confidence, and then being able to take on much larger projects now, because now it's easy. They have a construction crews, they've got trucks, they've got science, they've got people on big machines and graders and bulldozers, and so now they're doing it. But it just takes a while to build that
Yeah.
confidence.
Yeah. Well, that's just another reason I need to visit New Mexico.
Come anytime, my friend. Come anytime. And I'd be offended if you didn't look us up while you were here. So
Yeah.
yeah, you gotta come. Before I let
Yeah.
you go, I did want to talk a little bit about, because I know we've talked about the Office of Rural and Farm Worker Housing. Can you talk a little bit about RCAC? Tell us about RCAC and your role there.
Sure. Yeah. Um, I'm on their board of directors. I just recently completed my term serving as the board president.
Okay.
And so I'm past president now and still serving. And um, the RCAC, it's been a real privilege to be involved with them. They serve 13 Western states,
Hmm.
including New Mexico, including, I can get a list for you, but,
Okay.
Arizona,
Yep.
Utah, uh, and the Pacific Northwest. And they do focus on underserved communities. They have some really innovative programs that they've developed, many serving tribal communities and indigenous communities, including Native Alaskan and Native Hawaiians. Um, they've one of the programs that I want to make sure to draw attention to, Roger, that you may be familiar already with, but it's called the Tribal Housing Excellence Academy,
Hmm.
or they use the acronym of the THE
Hmm.
for Tribal Housing Excellence, and it's a very intensive educational opportunity for tribal housing organizations, those that receive NAHASDA funding, and it helps them with the development process, and understanding um, the potential resources out there that are not currently being leveraged by many tribal entities. That could be like home funds or maybe state funds or maybe debt, but also trying to identify where some of the problems are with those funds. And they bring in a lot of expertise from Native American communities who have experience. I know RCAC hopes to replicate that. They will offer another Tribal Housing Excellence Academy once they're able to assemble the financing needed to support it. So it's not on a real regular schedule yet because it requires some financial underwriting before they can do another one. Um, I was gonna let me pause there, and I was gonna mention another program, but am I getting into too much detail on?
No, 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 not at all. In fact, I was going to ask you to speak a little bit about the Rooted Relative Fund.
Yeah, good, right. That is really very innovative and something that the organization has been a real leader with, and it's very unique. It's essentially trying to create access to capital for indigenous communities, primarily entrepreneurs. So this is more business oriented rather than housing, for example. Um, but it's based on a different set of lending criteria, not kind of the conventional bank type of stuff. And it's more about community knowledge and existing trust relationships that an applicant or a borrower might have. So it's very relational. It was developed, RCAC established, we called it an Indigenous Advisory Council, where we were able to get the time of some really valuable um, part, Indigenous participants to help create this with this new product and program for this type of lending. And right now it's focused primarily on New Mexico and Arizona, and has some organizations that are also indigenous focused that are leading the outreach and trying to help deploy those funds. But it's a very new way of doing lending. Well, it's a new program for us anyway, and it's really been well received, and we're hoping to build on the momentum that's being created with this product.
That's really great, and it's really encouraging to hear there's those resources. And so you think those resources are going to be more robust kind of moving forward? And what kind of plans do you have for the future?
Yeah, I hope so. That is, we're we're in the early stages right now of that program being underway, where they're considering, people who are putting in proposals to borrow funds to either establish or grow their business. Um, but our desire is for it to grow, not only in like the lending capacity that might be associated with New Mexico and Arizona, but also geographically, so that I hope it can come up to the Pacific Northwest
Hmm.
and do something similar. We're not quite there yet. It's still kind of in its early stages, but very positive early returns. So we're encouraged about the direction it's taking.
Very exciting. Marty, as we start heading toward the conclusion, I wanted to ask you some questions about what advice would you offer to tribal entities and regarding to this type of housing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about it in terms
Uh,
of like self confidence, but what advice would you offer?
um, I think, what is really valuable from my perspective of um, knowing who you're trying to provide housing for, and what you'd like it to look like, so that, is that an individual unit, like a standalone home, or is it a fourplex, or is it, a 20 unit apartment, or that can differ from place to place. And also, maybe more of the just embracing the demographics too, of saying, and it's for families, and here are their incomes, so that, from my perspective, as an organization that provides technical assistance and development assistance, when folks can provide us with a clear vision of who they want to try to, how they want to try to create housing, that really helps us understand what will work and what won't, and help us narrow in on resources that are available, or resources that are a waste of time because it's not going to work. Um, so, um, so I think things can be done. I'm always hopeful. I always want to be optimistic that we can achieve our goals, and we can make a difference. And so just, trying to as clearly define who you're trying to serve, and is really a very valuable starting place.
That's very clear. Thank you for that. I want to take you back a little bit further when you were talking about the farm worker in fear. What advice would you give to the farm worker in general? Just, the no name, but that farm worker in fear. What advice would you give them?
My advice would be, seek support. There's a lot of organizations that are interested in trying to help stabilize the situation, and have people know what their rights are, and that might be their employer,
Hmm.
or it might be a service provider. There's lots of job training organizations, or service provider organizations that do childcare, or parenting classes. Many of those organizations are also trying to provide information and support farm workers. So that would be my advice, is to just, seek out those resources, and don't and be willing to ask trusted resources if they are able to help.
That's good advice. Going back to your days at your family orchard as a younger person, what advice would you give to the Gen Z right now, of very specifically in terms of them being of service? Like, how would you advise them, inspire them to be of service?
Um, I think, kind of rolling up your sleeves and getting out and meeting people face to face.
Hmm.
I think that makes a huge difference. To get into our communities, get to know people. What are the resources? What are the challenges? I think when you start to establish those relationships that are personal, that are real, that are face to face. I mean, I'm, I think that really makes a difference. And so I would say, try to get yourself out there and meet people and experience those communities.
Yeah, you said real and face to face. You mean that I didn't hear you use the word virtual once.
Right. Yeah. 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 Exactly.
What's the backstory of an example of a project that recently came together?
Yeah. Sure. I heard you say Skagit, but could you say the other one that you
The
mentioned?
St. Catherine de Vigry Villas. Is that the other one?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And I could do either of those, although when I was hearing the description, a different one came to mind. Is it okay if I use a
Yeah,
different
go for it,
example?
please. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, we were um, we were working in the northern part of Central Washington in a community called Kashmir. And Kashmir is near Wenatchee, and it's a big fruit growing area. And they also have a lot of processing, warehouses and things like that. So there's lots of agricultural employment. And we were approached by an association of employers there that wanted to do something for their workforce. And so we engaged with them and started exploring more specifically how many people they were trying to provide housing for and what this might need to look like, and whether it was for year-round occupancy or occupied on a seasonal basis. Um, after we got a good sense for that, we started looking for land. And we were fortunate to find a great piece of property that had access to their water and sewer services. It was also adjacent to a creek, and which we had to be careful of because we didn't want to have a negative impact on the creek. Um, so we helped acquire that property and then hired a architect and a contractor to devise a plan. Then we went about the process of securing financing, and in that case, there's a mixture of both public and private sources of capital. Once that was assembled, then we issued what's called a notice to proceed to our contractor to start the work. And about 12 months later, we were finished with what became known as Brender Creek, and it serves up to 200 people. And But one of the things I like about it so much is it is for seasonal occupancy, so unrelated individuals can share a unit, but they also have their own space and common area and kitchen and laundry. But 200 sounds like a lot of people, and it is. But one of the things I like most about this site is when you're on it, it's in a beautiful area. There's orchards around and the nearby uh, foothills of the Cascades. It doesn't feel crowded. The layout is really nice, so that even though there's a lot of people there, you don't feel like or at least for me, doesn't feel cramped and like there's no space to breathe. So um, that overall time frame was probably a little over. It was between 3 and 4 years from start to finish. There were a variety of challenges along the way, but that's common. But today, Brender Creek is there and operational and a valuable resource to their community.
What's the difference on the ground between seasonal and permanent occupancy?
That's a good question. We have to, we try to be to always work in the best interest of the client and make their proposals as competitive as possible, regardless of who else is going in for who else may be competing for the same program. So sometimes, and we'll disclose if there's more than one proposal going in, but we're committed to and dedicated to the proposal for each of those clients is the best it can possibly be, and maxing out the scoring for when it's a competitive process and that sort of thing.
When you have two clients that are eligible for the same funding, how do you manage any conflict of interests?
Yeah, great question. So permanent housing is, pretty conventional, what you might imagine. And by that I mean one home or one unit would be fully self-contained for that family. So it would have, 2 or 3 bedrooms, most commonly, one or two bathrooms, a kitchen, common space, and it would all be for one family. They would have access, and it would be just for that family. For seasonal occupancy, what that's looked like for us, and this can really vary from place to place, but I'll tell you what looks like in Washington State, and that is, that is more of the migrant farm worker community, and including H-2A workers. And usually, what that means is it's individuals, not families. And a way we've made that financially more feasible is with more of a congregate style of housing. And by that I mean we may have one unit, quote unquote, that could have 6 bedrooms, and each of those bedrooms has one person or two people in it. And then there's a common living area and a common kitchen. So like in this example, let's say there's 6 people. They would all share the kitchen, and there's probably 2 bathrooms that they would all share. That way you're able to accommodate more people, and not have the expense of an individual unit for each one of those individuals. So that congregate housing style, kind of like a dorm, although with kitchen and bathroom within each unit, has been one way to help serve that population while keeping construction costs reasonable.
What would happen if farm workers get disqualified because they earn too much?
It's a big problem. And in fact, you're absolutely right, Jeff. We're trying to describe that as a policy issue for the public funders that are involved with it. Some are more receptive to that message, to say, we will try to provide you some latitude. Others are more stringent and say, sorry, this is an income restricted program, and if you're over income, then you're not eligible. There's not a good solution to it right now. And making matters worse, Jeff, is that even though farm worker incomes are rising, they still often cannot afford the market. So like a farm worker a farm worker household may have been at 30% of the area median income, and now they're at 40%. Well, that's good. We're, of course, happy that incomes are rising, maybe even 50%. But the market, to afford something in the market, you need to make 80% or 100%. So it's a real conundrum. I wish I had a better answer for you.
How do you help with financing? Do you seek multiple term sheets for clients, or just work with a few trusted lenders?
We always, our general approach is competition is good. That we want everybody, including financiers, to keep their pencil sharp, and bring their best proposals. We do have groups that we work more frequently with, lenders. But sometimes, they're not always the best option. And when a better option presents itself, then that's what we recommend. So, we do cultivate relationships. We do use some organizations and lenders regularly, but we also are welcoming new folks who, want to get into this space and do the work, and especially, if they're able to offer some competitive financing.
Do you get involved with refinancing?
Yeah, we do that type of assistance as needed. Excuse me. We don't like keep a financing schedule for those types of longer term strategies, although we are always, we maintain those relationships with our clients, forever. So if they call us to say, hey, we are thinking about this, what do you think? We're going to talk to them about it and explore it and try to advise them. Sometimes they may hire us to say, okay, can you help us again with a refi, after actually, well, I'll give you a more concrete example. There are three properties up in the Wenatchee area that are farm worker housing, and that need reinvestment. And so we last year were able to secure about 4.2 million through the U.S. Department of Agriculture to refresh the units. So we do that type of work, but we often wait for our client to initiate the process and tell us when they feel like it's needed and they want to move forward.
Do you get involved with equity financing or raising philanthropic funds?
We have not had that great of luck with like foundations when it comes to housing and kind of those capital expenditures. So we've not done a lot of that. Some of our clients do capital campaigns, and that's also not really a strength of ours. We can help provide them the information, that can then help them do a capital campaign. But we don't have that kind of in-house capacity, because it's a lot of oftentimes sort of relationship building stuff with, wealthy people or foundations in the area that we may or may not have awareness of. And then, you mentioned equity. I think, there's a potential opportunity with community development financial institutions, CDFIs, that can build products tailored to, for example, tribal housing entities. And so I think there can be some opportunities that way.
Do you keep a schedule to refresh expiring tax credit projects? Do you re-engage?
Yeah, usually there too, it's often at their request, but you're probably familiar with within the tax credit industry, they call it year 15 when the investor can leave. And so we've assisted our clients with that year 15 transition where their investor partner is exiting and they take over sole ownership. That can include refinancing some debt at that time. And so another thing kind of related, this isn't exactly what you asked, but there's also we assist organizations that may want to do acquisition of affordable housing in their community. So we call that preservation. And so we also provide that type of assistance when one of our nonprofit partners, for example, wants to acquire some existing housing in their community and maintain it as affordable housing.
Because you are collecting developer fees, do you refrain from recommending deferred developer fees as a gap financing source?
Yeah. If at all possible, we try to avoid deferred developer fee, because a lot of organizations, need that capital to be able to help sustain their work. Sometimes it's a necessity. But we also will look for gap fillers from other sources. Again, we've developed some relationships with some CDFIs who might be able to do some lower interest loans for a few $100,000 or something that can help fill a gap. Or we might be able to, expand some private debt, to a smaller degree to fill those gaps, or even go, on occasion, this is less common, but we can try to approach the public funders too to say, hey, this unexpected circumstance arose and it has this financial impact. Can you help us out, with another whatever the number is? So we try to look at all of that stuff, and because if it's not operationally sustainable at the end of the day, then we've all got a problem, including us, because we have long-term relationships with our clients and sponsors, and if they're not happy with the work that we've done, then they don't have to use us again. And so we want to be dedicated to not only getting the thing built, but assuring that it's got the operating resources necessary to sustain itself.
Do you help identify, bid, and contract with general contractors?
Yeah, we do assist with that process. Most commonly is that we do a request for proposals, or sometimes a negotiated bid with general contractors, and we have a thorough review process, where we evaluate their credentials and their standing, to make sure they don't have some liens or lawsuits against them and stuff like that. So we're involved throughout that process, to make ultimately it's our client's decision, but we help them evaluate the proposals and any experiential stuff that we can add to the decision-making process. Some of our clients want to act as the general contractor, and that can work in certain circumstances. In other circumstances, it's problematic. As a general rule of thumb, the more complicated the financing, the less likely it should be owner builder. Like tax credit finance projects. Some can do it. Some have the capacity to, but because of the stringent requirements that the investors have on delivery of the development and all the financial ramifications, we often try to steer people away from doing it themselves unless they've got a real track record of being able to successfully pull that off.
How involved do you get with trying to avoid price escalation on a project?
We're on a project basis, we're typically right in the middle of it. Budget management is one of our core responsibilities on behalf of the people that we work for, the organizations that we work for. So yeah, we're right in the middle of it. One of the things that we do early on, kind of in addition to the contract negotiations themselves, is to make sure we have a good, reasonable contingency fund. Excuse me, a contingency that is outside of the construction contract. So by that I mean it's the owner's discretion about how that contingency is used. Some we'll see, and you've probably seen this too, where within a construction contract, either sometimes an architect or the contractor themselves will want to have their own contingency built in, as a hedge against future materials pricing. That's not necessarily, we try to avoid that if possible, to try to get a more concrete number so we can get to a guaranteed contract. That's our preferred path forward. But in addition to that, we also make sure we have that contingency budget line item that is baked into the overall financing and at the sole discretion of the owner.
How involved do you get in the weeds with subcontractors? Like, for example, Finding local labor across trades can be a challenge in some rural areas.
Yeah. Our primary strategy is that we work to get to the number, the contract number we can afford with the general contractor. And then, and then it's up to him or her, it's up to them to manage the subs. So if they bring us an issue regarding subcontractor pricing, then we'll get involved with it. But, our preferred method, is that we do the upfront work. And by that, I mean, get a good set of permit ready drawings and all the materials spec'd out clearly so that we have a really solid construction number. And then that becomes the basis of the contract. And for lack of a better term, if during that contract period the contractor has a problem with a sub that has changed their pricing, well, the contractor needs to resolve that because they've made a commitment in the form of this contract that they signed. That's a real challenge in rural communities and many tribal communities that are geographically remote. They don't have the same access to general contractors, much less subcontractors that many larger communities do.
How do we overcome this challenge?
We're working on right now is, like the state of Washington has a very stringent building code, which emphasizes a lot of energy efficiency stuff, which is good. At the end of the day, we want to be about that work too. Um, and but so like they have some heating and cooling requirements that have kind of this newer technology like ductless mini splits and things like that that can provide more efficient heating and cooling. But there's also fewer people who can work on those to repair them, especially again in rural areas. There's older technology that's still pretty good, PTAC type HVAC, which is like as you probably know, it's like what is commonly in like a hotel room that is heating and air conditioning. Yes, it's older technology. It's not quite as efficient, but people know how to work on it, and it can be replaced if needed. So that's in my opinion, that's a good example of kind of the challenge, the push and pull of energy efficiency versus kind of what can really practically work, especially in rural communities, where you might not have the technician who's experienced with the ductless compressor system, but they know how to repair or replace a PTAC machine.
How do you help estimate operating expenses if you don't actually operate the projects? How do you stay up to date on costs? And then do you follow up with clients to see how their costs have changed over time?
Yeah, you basically hit it right on the head. If we have a new project or an existing project, the what we start with is working with that client and say, what are your current operations look like? Can you share a budget either on that development itself or if they have a comparable development, that is current. So we keep that, we request that information and update budgets. And then because we do this type of work for a variety of organizations, we can see some trends so that, like, let's say we have a new client who's never built or operated housing before. We can make some general assumptions based on the experienced people that we've worked for who've provided us with their actual expenses and then provide that as a starting point, for the new project. But one other thing I'll say just real quickly on that, Jeff, is that um, this is an area where we try to work intentionally with our client to really get them to embrace those operating budget assumptions as their responsibility. Because as you said, and recognize, they're going to be the ones who are the owners and operators. So we want those to be uh, assumptions that they're comfortable with, they've taken ownership of. We don't want to give them something that's unrealistic, and then once they open the doors, find that they've got an operating deficit. So we'll help them create it. We'll give them some samples. We'll give them some kind of general parameters for what we think it might look like. But then we'll also help them try to, reach out to their utility provider or reach out to their insurance company and get concrete numbers, that they know the source, they're putting it in there so that, they're comfortable with the assumptions.
I'm just amazed, and thank you so much for really underscoring and highlighting the Office of Rural Farm Worker Housing, RCAC, National Rural Housing Coalition, and the National Farm Work Housing Directors Association. I mean, all these amazing organizations that have been impactful to you, and you've been impactful to them and in your experiences. And I just think that, Marty, thank you. And Tony Campello is proud of you and your work in this interview and this amazing amount of progress that you make. I wanted to offer you just one last word, and really it is the last word, actually. If you were to summarize this experience of this interview in just a word, what word would you use?
The first word that comes to mind is thankful. I'm thankful to meet you. I'm thankful to learn more about the needs of the needs of your community, and to learn more about the Flower Hill Institute. And I'm thankful that you wanted my opinion. I appreciate that. So I feel thankful to have this opportunity, Roger.
Right back at you, brother. My last word is honored. I'm honored to meet you and to get to know you and from where you came from. And, you talked about your family, you talked about Tony, you talked about your education, you talked about the struggles, you talked about those nameless farm workers of who you're of service to. And you're an amazing human being, and I hope to meet more of you. So just thank you for being you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And right back at you.
All right, man. Thanks. Come to New Mexico.
I will. Yeah. Thank you.
I look forward to that. Thanks.